September 12, 1943. A date that would reshape the landscape of the American West in ways no one could have predicted. While headlines screamed about Allied advances in Italy and the Pacific Theater, something quieter but no less extraordinary was happening in the vast cattle ranches of Montana. German prisoners of war, women captured in North Africa and Europe, were being transported to rural work camps across America to address the severe labor shortage caused by the war. But when a transport truck carrying 27 German women rolled through the gates of the Crazy Mountains labor camp outside Livingston, Montana, the ranchers and cowboys waiting to receive them stood in stunned silence. These weren't the hardened enemy soldiers they had been preparing to supervise. They were young women, exhausted and frightened, about to step into a world so foreign to them it might as well have been another planet. What could possibly bridge the gap between European prisoners who had never seen land stretch beyond the horizon and American cowboys whose entire identity was built on that very endlessness? Before we discover how these unlikely groups found common ground on the Montana prairie, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story truly begins 6 months earlier, in March of 1943, when the War Department first proposed the unprecedented program. With millions of American men overseas and farms across the nation desperate for workers, officials made a controversial decision. They would transport German POWs, including women captured serving in auxiliary roles, to agricultural work camps throughout the American interior. The idea sparked immediate debate. How could enemy prisoners be trusted with America's food supply? What message would it send to have German nationals working freely on American soil while American sons died fighting their countrymen? But necessity won over apprehension, and by late summer, the program was underway. The Crazy Mountains camp was established on land leased from 3 neighboring cattle ranches. A temporary compound of simple barracks surrounded by a single fence, more symbolic than secure, given that escape into the endless Montana wilderness would be suicide for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. The ranchers who had agreed to employ the prisoners were a skeptical group. Men like Frank Hutchinson, a third-generation cattle rancher whose 2 sons were fighting in Europe, viewed the arrangement with barely concealed hostility. Tom Reeves, whose sprawling property stretched across 15,000 acres, had lost his younger brother at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The idea of German prisoners working his land felt like betrayal, but they needed hands desperately, and the government offered favorable terms. Among the cowboys hired as supervisors was 32-year-old Jacob Morrison, known throughout Park County as one of the finest horsemen in Montana. Jake had been rejected for military service due to a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp, a source of shame he carried quietly. He approached the assignment with cautious curiosity rather than anger, wondering what these German women would make of life under the big sky. The transport truck kicked up a cloud of dust visible for miles across the flat prairie as it approached the camp on that September afternoon. Jake Morrison stood with his hat pulled low against the sun, watching the vehicle grow larger against the endless blue sky. Beside him, Frank Hutchinson shifted his weight impatiently, arms crossed over his chest. A handful of other ranch hands and supervisors waited in uncomfortable silence, unsure what to expect. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas flap at the back was pulled aside, what emerged defied every expectation. The German women climbed down one by one, blinking against the brilliant Montana sunlight. They wore a mixture of faded auxiliary uniforms and civilian clothes, all showing signs of long travel. Their faces carried exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. These were women who had crossed an ocean as prisoners, traveled by rail across a continent, and now found themselves in a landscape so vast it seemed to swallow the sky itself. Among them was 24-year-old Greta Schiller, a former communications officer from Berlin who had been captured in Tunisia. She had spent months in a holding facility in New York before this transfer, and nothing in that experience had prepared her for Montana. As she stepped down from the truck, her eyes went wide. The land stretched in every direction without interruption, mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. She had never seen so much space, so much emptiness. It made her feel simultaneously free and terrifyingly exposed. Beside her, 19-year-old Liesl Hoffman clutched a small bundle containing her only possessions. Liesl had grown up in Hamburg, where buildings pressed close together and streets were narrow corridors between stone walls. This openness felt unnatural, almost threatening. She whispered to Greta in German, "Where does it end?" Greta had no answer. The camp commandant, Major William Carter, stepped forward to address the new arrivals. He was a career military man in his 50s, too old for combat duty but experienced enough to handle the complex politics of a POW labor camp. His voice carried across the dusty yard as he explained the basic rules. The women would work 6 days per week on the surrounding ranches. They would be paid a small wage in camp scrip, given adequate food and shelter, and treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Escape would be pointless and dangerous. Cooperation would make their time here tolerable. As Major Carter spoke, Jake Morrison studied the women's faces. He saw fear there, certainly, but also something else. Resignation, perhaps, or a kind of numb acceptance that their lives had become something beyond their control. One woman in particular caught his attention. She stood slightly apart from the others, her posture straight despite obvious exhaustion. She had blonde hair pulled back severely and sharp features that might have been beautiful, if not marked by such weariness. Her eyes moved constantly, taking in everything, calculating and assessing. This was 26-year-old Anneliese Volker, who had served as a supply coordinator for the Wehrmacht before her capture. Unlike many of her companions, Anneliese had some understanding of where they were. She had studied maps during the long journey west, trying to comprehend the scale of America. But studying maps and standing in the actual landscape were entirely different experiences. The vastness unsettled her in ways she couldn't articulate. The first full day of work began before dawn. The women were roused from their barracks while stars still filled the sky, given a breakfast of coffee and oatmeal, then loaded into trucks that would take them to the various ranches. The September air carried a chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. Greta found herself assigned to the Hutchinson Ranch along with 5 other women. Frank Hutchinson met them at his gate with barely concealed irritation, his weathered face set in hard lines. He gestured toward a massive field where hay bales needed to be loaded onto wagons, explained the task in terse English, then walked away without checking if they understood. The women looked at each other uncertainly before setting to work. The bales were heavier than they appeared, and the Montana sun, gentle in the early morning, became punishing by midday. Greta's hands, accustomed to radio equipment and paperwork, blistered within the first hour, but she didn't complain. None of them did. Complaining would only confirm whatever negative assumptions their captors already held. At the Reeves Ranch, Liesel and 4 others were put to work mending fence lines that stretched for miles across rolling hills. Tom Reeves watched them from horseback, his expression unreadable behind sunglasses. He said little, communicating mostly through gestures and the occasional barked command. Liesel found the work monotonous but oddly meditative. The repetitive motion of twisting wire, the vast silence broken only by wind and the occasional call of a hawk overhead, it created a strange peace she hadn't expected. Anneliese was assigned to Jake Morrison's crew at a smaller ranch owned by a widow named Martha Collins. Martha was in her 60s, her husband having died 3 years earlier, leaving her with more land than she could manage alone. Jake had been helping her keep the operation running, and now he had 3 German prisoners added to his workforce. He approached the situation differently than the other ranchers. When he saw Anneliese and her 2 companions, Hilda and Margareta, standing uncertainly by the barn, he didn't bark orders. Instead, he walked over slowly, his limp more pronounced in the early morning stiffness, and spoke in a measured tone. "Morning, ladies. I know you probably don't speak much English, but we'll figure it out. Today we're moving cattle from the south pasture to better grazing. Ever worked with cows before?" The women stared at him blankly. Anneliese understood some English but wasn't confident enough to respond. Jake smiled slightly, not unkindly, and gestured for them to follow. Actions would teach better than words. He led them to where a dozen horses stood in a corral, their breath creating small clouds in the cool air. The sight of the animals made Hilda gasp audibly. She had grown up in Munich and had never been this close to a horse. They seemed impossibly large, powerful creatures that could crush her without effort. Jake noticed her fear and approached one of the gentler mares, a dappled gray named Rosie. He ran his hand along the horse's neck, speaking softly, demonstrating that these animals responded to calm confidence rather than force. Then he did something unexpected. He took Annalise's hand, still rough from weeks of labor in the New York facility, and placed it against Rosie's warm shoulder. The horse's skin twitched slightly, but she didn't move. Annalise felt the animal's heat, its breathing, the solid realness of this creature. Something shifted in that moment. This wasn't theoretical war or political ideology. This was simply life, immediate and demanding. By the end of the first week, the German women had begun to understand the rhythm of ranch life. It was a language spoken not in words but in actions, in the movement of animals and the changing light across endless grassland. The work was brutal for women unaccustomed to such physical demands, but it was also strangely honest. There were no politics here, no ideologies to navigate, just cattle that needed moving, fences that needed mending, and land that required constant attention. Greta discovered muscles she never knew existed. Her back ached from lifting hay bales, her shoulders burned from hours of repetitive motion, and her hands had developed calluses that would have horrified her former self. Yet there was satisfaction in the exhaustion. At night, she fell into dreamless sleep, too tired for the nightmares that had plagued her in the holding facility. The work left no energy for dwelling on the past or worrying about an uncertain future. Liesel found unexpected beauty in the daily routine. She had always been the artistic one in her family, sketching in margins and seeing poetry in ordinary moments. Montana gave her more material than she could process. The way morning light turned the mountains pink and gold, the patterns wind made in the tall grass, the silhouettes of cattle moving like dark clouds across distant hills. She began keeping a small journal, sketching when she had spare moments, trying to capture this strange new world. Annalise's transformation was more subtle but perhaps most profound. She had always been the practical one, the organizer who made things run efficiently. Jake Morrison recognized this quality in her almost immediately. He started giving her more responsibility, showing her how to anticipate what needed doing before being told. Within days, she was helping coordinate the work of the other women, translating his instructions and organizing tasks in the most efficient sequence. Jake found himself impressed, despite his initial reservations. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a water trough, he attempted conversation. "Where in Germany?" he asked, his English slow and clear. "Berlin," Annalise replied carefully, her accent thick but understandable. Jake nodded. "Big city. This must be very different." She looked around at the endless landscape, searching for words. "So large," she finally said, gesturing at the space around them. We couldn't look away. It was the first real exchange between them, brief and simple, but it opened a door that had been closed. Jake realized these women weren't the enemy in any meaningful sense. They were just people caught in circumstances beyond their control, trying to survive with whatever dignity they could maintain. That evening, as the women returned to camp, Greta noticed something had changed in how they moved. They walked with less hesitation, less fear. The landscape that had seemed threatening now felt merely vast. They were beginning to understand that Montana demanded respect but offered something in return: space to breathe, work that mattered, and the possibility of being seen as something other than enemy prisoners. October brought the first serious cold snap, and with it an unexpected shift in the daily routine. Martha Collins, the widow whose ranch employed Annalise's crew, made a decision that would ripple through the entire camp. She invited the 3 German women to eat lunch inside her farmhouse, rather than in the field. Jake Morrison looked surprised when Martha announced this, but he knew better than to argue with the old woman. She had her own sense of what was right, and it rarely aligned with conventional thinking. That first meal was awkward beyond description. The women sat stiffly at Martha's kitchen table, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being treated as guests rather than prisoners. Martha served beef stew and fresh bread, pouring coffee without asking if they wanted any. She spoke to them as she would to anyone, seemingly unconcerned that they understood perhaps 1 word in 5. Annalise tried to express gratitude in her limited English. "Thank you, Mrs. Very kind." Martha waved off the thanks. "You work hard, you eat proper. That's how it works here." The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of home cooking, The simple act of sitting at a table like human beings rather than enemies, it cracked something open in all three women. Hilda began to cry quietly, tears running down her face as she ate. She was remembering her mother's kitchen in Munich, meals shared before the world fell apart. Within 2 weeks, other ranchers began following Martha's example. Frank Hutchinson remained resistant, but his wife Eleanor had other ideas. She started bringing hot soup to the fields at midday, serving the German women alongside the regular ranch hands. Tom Reeves allowed his housekeeper to set up a table in the barn where workers could eat together out of the wind. These small gestures of basic humanity changed the atmosphere entirely. Cowboys who had maintained cold distance began making small talk, teaching the women English words for various tools and animals. The women responded by working harder, taking initiative, showing they could be trusted with more responsibility. Jake noticed how Annalise's English improved rapidly through these daily interactions. She had a gift for languages, picking up not just words but the rhythm and tone of how Montana people spoke. She began serving as an unofficial translator for the other women, but more than that, she became a bridge between two groups that had started as enemies. One evening in late October, as Jake drove the women back to camp, Annalise surprised him with a question. "Mr. Jake, why you help us? You could be angry, your country and my country fighting." Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Finally he said, "I figure you didn't start this war any more than I did. We're all just trying to get through it best we can." Annalise nodded slowly, understanding more than just his words. She was beginning to grasp something fundamental about the American character, at least as it expressed itself here in Montana. These people judged you by your work and your character, not by where you came from or what uniform you once wore. November arrived with the first snow, dusting the mountains white and signaling the approaching end of the outdoor work season. The ranches shifted into winter mode, focusing on maintaining livestock and preparing for the brutal months ahead. The German women had now been in Montana for nearly 3 months, and the transformation was visible in more than just their calloused hands and sun-weathered faces. They moved with confidence across terrain that had once terrified them. They understood the rhythms of ranch life, anticipated needs before being told, and had earned grudging respect from even the most skeptical cowboys. But it was the Thanksgiving holiday that truly marked the turning point in their integration into this strange new world. Major Carter at the camp had debated whether to acknowledge the American holiday at all. These were prisoners of war, after all, not guests. But he had received letters from several of the ranchers requesting permission to include the women in their family celebrations. Martha Collins had been particularly insistent, arguing that Christian charity demanded nothing less. On Thanksgiving Day, instead of returning to camp, the women found themselves invited into American homes. Greta and her crew were brought to the Hutchinson Ranch, where Eleanor had prepared a feast that made the German women's eyes widen. Turkey, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of vegetables, fresh rolls, and pies that filled the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and apples. Frank Hutchinson sat at the head of the table, his discomfort obvious but his manners intact. His wife had made her wishes clear, and he would honor them even if grudgingly. As the meal progressed, something unexpected happened. Eleanor asked Greta, through a combination of simple English and gestures, about her family in Germany. Greta's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain. "Mother, father, in Hamburg." Don't know if she paused, unable to finish. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We'll pray they're safe." Frank looked away, his jaw tight. His own sons were somewhere in Europe, facing German soldiers. Yet here sat this German girl, crying for her family just as his own wife cried for their boys. The enemy had a face now, and it looked heartbreakingly human. At Martha's farmhouse, Annalise sat between Jake and Martha, struggling to follow the rapid conversation, but catching enough to understand the warmth. Martha's daughter had come from Billings with her 2 children, and the kids were fascinated by the German women, asking endless questions in the thoughtless curiosity of youth. Jake found himself translating, his own understanding of Annalise's limited English helping bridge the gap. He noticed how naturally she smiled at the children, how her whole face softened when the little girl showed her a doll. As the evening wound down and Jake prepared to drive the women back to camp, Martha pulled him aside. "That Annalise," she said quietly, "she's got good character. You can see it in how she works, how she treats people." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to say more. He had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to acknowledge it, even to himself. December brought news that shattered the fragile peace the women had found in Montana. The Red Cross had finally managed to deliver letters from Germany, the first communication many of the women had received in over a year. The mail call at camp that cold evening was unlike anything Major Carter had witnessed in his military career. As names were called, some women rushed forward with desperate hope, while others hung back, afraid of what they might learn. Greta received a letter from her aunt in Bremen. Her hands shook as she read the brief message, written in August. Her parents were dead, killed in an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg in July of 1943. The family apartment was destroyed. Her younger sister was living with distant relatives in the countryside, but her aunt had no recent news of her whereabouts or condition. Greta read the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated. Then she walked calmly to her bunk, lay down facing the wall, and didn't speak for 2 days. Liesel's news was equally devastating. Her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had been firebombed. Her mother and 2 younger brothers were presumed dead, though no bodies had been recovered. Her father, who had worked in a munitions factory, had been arrested after the July 20th plot against Hitler, though he had no connection to the conspirators. No one knew where he had been taken. Other women received no letters at all, which was somehow worse than bad news. At least the dead had certainty. The silence left only terrible imagination. Anneliese was among those who received nothing. She had written to her family's address in Berlin through the Red Cross months ago, but had heard nothing in return. The not knowing gnawed at her in ways physical hardship never had. The despair that settled over the camp was palpable. Women who had been learning English stopped trying. Those who had shown interest in their work went through motions, mechanically. The small shoots of hope that had been growing in Montana soil withered under the weight of grief and guilt. The ranchers noticed immediately. Martha Collins found Anneliese staring out across the frozen prairie, her face blank. "Child, what's wrong?" Martha asked gently. Anneliese struggled to find English words for the complex emotions churning inside her. "My family," she finally managed. "I don't know if they live. And my country, everything burning, everything destroyed." She turned to Martha with haunted eyes. "We did this. My country did terrible things, and now we pay. But my mother, my little brother, they did nothing. They just lived." Martha had no easy comfort to offer. She had heard the reports coming from Europe, the stories of concentration camps and atrocities. But she also saw the genuine anguish in this young woman's face. That evening, Martha did something unprecedented. She invited Anneliese to stay at the farmhouse rather than return to camp. Major Carter, when contacted, gave reluctant permission. One prisoner, closely supervised, seemed an acceptable risk. Jake Morrison was surprised to find Anneliese sitting at Martha's kitchen table when he arrived the next morning. Her eyes red from crying, but her composure mostly restored. Martha had stayed up half the night with her, letting her talk through her grief in a mixture of German and broken English, offering the simple ministry of presence. The blizzard hit on December 18th, with a ferocity that shocked even longtime Montana residents. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie, erasing all landmarks and turning the world into a whiteout. Jake had been helping Martha secure the barn when the storm descended with shocking speed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to mere feet. They managed to get the horses inside and the cattle moved to a sheltered draw, but 3 cows were missing, likely trapped somewhere in the south pasture. Jake knew that in these conditions, exposure meant death within hours. The animals needed to be found immediately. Anneliese had been staying at the farmhouse for the past week, helping Martha with indoor work, while the other women remained at camp. When Jake announced his intention to search for the missing cattle, she surprised both him and Martha by insisting on coming along. "You cannot go alone," she said firmly in her improving English. "Is too dangerous. 1 person falls, no one knows. 2 persons, more safe." Jake started to argue but recognized the logic. "Number fan." Martha tied scarves around both their faces and made them rope themselves together with 50 feet of line between them. "If you're not back in 2 hours, I'm sending for help," she warned. The world outside was chaos. Snow stung any exposed skin like needles, and the wind howled with a sound that seemed almost alive. Jake led them toward where he thought the south pasture lay, relying more on instinct than sight. Annalise followed, keeping the rope taut between them, her body bent against the wind. They found the first cow dead, already half buried in a drift. The second was sheltered behind a rock outcropping, still alive but weakening. Jake managed to get her moving back toward the barn, with Annalise pushing from behind. The work was exhausting, every step a battle against wind and cold and drifting snow. Then disaster struck. Jake's bad leg gave out on an icy patch, and he went down hard. Pain shot through his knee, and when he tried to stand, the leg wouldn't support his weight. He had twisted it badly, possibly worse. Through the howling wind, he shouted to Annalise, "Go back! Get help!" But Annalise had lived through Russian winters during her childhood years in East Prussia before her family moved to Berlin. She understood cold and what it could do to an injured person left alone. Instead of running for help, she made a decision. She got Jake's arm over her shoulder and half carried, half dragged him toward where she hoped the barn stood. The cow, sensing the direction of shelter, followed them. It took 40 minutes to cover what should have been a 10-minute walk. Annalise's strength was failing, her muscles screaming, frost forming on her eyelashes. But she kept moving, pulling Jake along, refusing to let either of them stop. When Martha's farmhouse finally emerged from the white chaos, it looked like salvation itself. They stumbled through the door, collapsing on the floor as Martha rushed to help them. Jake's leg was badly sprained, but not broken. Annalise had mild frostbite on her fingers. Both were hypothermic and exhausted. Jake spent 3 days recovering at Martha's farmhouse, his leg elevated and wrapped. The doctor from Livingston had made the dangerous trip out to examine him, confirming a severe sprain that would keep him off his feet for at least 2 weeks. During those days of forced inactivity, something shifted in the household dynamic. Annalise took over much of Jake's work, coordinating with the other ranch hands, making decisions about livestock management, and handling the daily operations with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself. Martha watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. She had recognized something in Annalise from the beginning, a core of strength and capability that captivity had not diminished. Now that strength was being put to use in ways that served rather than destroyed. In the evenings, Jake and Annalise talked. At first, the conversations were simple, focused on ranch work and practical matters, but gradually they deepened. Jake asked about her life before the war, and Annalise found herself describing a Berlin that no longer existed. She had been studying economics at university when the war began, planning a career in banking or finance. Her father was a postal clerk, her mother a seamstress. They were ordinary people who believed the promises of national renewal and security. "When did you know it was wrong?" Jake asked one evening. The question was direct, even blunt, but Annalise appreciated his honesty. "Not at first," she admitted, her English becoming more fluid as emotions ran high. "We thought we defended our country. They told us Germany was threatened, that we only protected ourselves. But later, when we saw things, heard things," she paused, struggling with both language and memory. Small things that didn't make sense, people disappearing, rules that seemed cruel for no reason. But by then, what could we do? To speak against it was to die. Jake listened without judgment. "I guess most people just try to survive," he said quietly. "Don't make you a monster, but don't make you innocent either. Just makes you human." The honesty of his assessment, free from either condemnation or false comfort, gave Annalise something she desperately needed. A framework for understanding her own complicated guilt. She had not committed atrocities, but she had served a system that did. She had not known the full extent of her country's crimes, but willful ignorance was its own kind of complicity. "What will you do when the war ends?" Jake asked. "Will you go back?" Annalise looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape. A month ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. Germany was home, regardless of everything. But now she wasn't certain. "I don't know what Germany will be anymore," she said softly. "Maybe it will be better, maybe it will be worse. But here, in this place, I know what is expected. Work hard, be honest, treat people with respect. Is simple, is clear." Jake understood what she wasn't quite saying. She had found something in Montana that Germany had not offered her in years. Not just physical safety, but moral clarity. The blizzard had forced a crisis that revealed character, and Annalise had proven herself when it mattered most. By mid-January, Jake was back on his feet, though he still favored his injured leg. The winter work had slowed to maintenance routines, feeding livestock and ensuring water sources didn't freeze. It gave him time to focus on something he'd been considering since the blizzard: teaching Annalise proper ranch skills rather than just manual labor. One morning, he brought out 2 coiled ropes from the barn. Annalise eyed them suspiciously, having seen the Cowboys use them to catch cattle but never imagining she might learn the skill herself. "Today you learned a rope," Jake announced. "Every good ranch hand needs to know how." Annalise protested that she was just a prisoner, that such skills were unnecessary for her temporary situation. But Jake was insistent. "You saved my life in that storm. Far as I'm concerned, that makes you more than just a prisoner. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you're better with the cattle than half the boys I've hired over the years." The lessons began simply. Jake showed her how to hold the rope, how to build a loop, how to swing it with the wrist rather than the whole arm. Annalise was clumsy at first, the rope tangling around her feet or falling short of its target. But she had learned patience through months of difficult work, and she applied that same determination to this new challenge. Hilda and Margaretha watched from the barn, amazed to see their companion being taught skills that seemed reserved for real cowboys. Over the following weeks, Annalise practiced whenever she had spare moments. Jake set up posts at various distances, and she worked on her accuracy. The repetitive motion was meditative, allowing her mind to quiet while her body learned the rhythm. She discovered she enjoyed the challenge, the way success required perfect timing and coordination. By February, she could rope a stationary target with reasonable accuracy. Jake decided it was time to try with actual cattle. He selected a gentle heifer in the corral and demonstrated first, his rope sailing out smoothly to settle around the animal's neck. Then he handed the rope to Annalise. "Your turn." Her first attempt missed badly. The second attempt caught the heifer's horn instead of her neck. But on the third try, the loop settled perfectly, and Annalise instinctively pulled it tight, just as Jake had shown her. The heifer stopped, held by the rope, and Annalise stood there in shock at her own success. Jake laughed, a genuine sound of pleasure. "There you go. Now you're a real ranch hand." The moment felt significant beyond just learning a skill. Annalise realized that Jake was giving her something precious, the knowledge and abilities that defined his own identity. He was treating her not as an enemy to be supervised, but as someone worthy of receiving his expertise. That evening, as they put away the equipment, Jake said something that had clearly been on his mind. "When this war ends," he began carefully, "and you have to decide what's next. Well, Martha and I were talking. We could use a good hand here, permanent, if you wanted to stay." Annalise looked at him, understanding the weight of what he was offering. This wasn't just a job, it was belonging. Spring arrived late in Montana that year, March bringing more snow before April finally delivered genuine warmth. As the land thawed and green returned to the prairie, the German women at the camp found themselves facing an unexpected reality. They had been in Montana for 7 months, and many of them no longer felt like prisoners. The work had become routine, even enjoyable. The relationships they had built with the ranchers and cowboys had evolved into something resembling friendship. The landscape that once terrified them now felt familiar, almost comfortable. Greta had recovered from the devastating news about her parents, though the grief remained. She had thrown herself into work at the Hutchinson Ranch with renewed intensity, as if constant motion could keep sorrow at bay. Eleanor Hutchinson had become a mother figure to her, teaching her English through patient conversation and including her in family activities. Even Frank had softened, occasionally sharing stories about his sons overseas, treating Greta almost like a daughter. Liesl had discovered an unexpected artistic outlet. The landscape she once found threatening had become her obsession. She sketched constantly, capturing the way light moved across the mountains, the patterns cattle made against snow, the weathered faces of the cowboys. Tom Reeves had noticed her talent and, in a gesture that surprised everyone, bought her a set of proper art supplies from Billings. The gift had made Liesl cry, not just from gratitude but from the recognition it represented. But the most profound transformation had occurred in Annalise. Her relationship with Jake Morrison had deepened in ways neither of them had intended or expected. They worked together daily, their communication now requiring few words. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them, and he trusted her judgment on ranch decisions. Martha watched the growing bond between them with a mixture of concern and hope. One evening in late April, as the three of them sat on Martha's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, the old woman finally addressed what everyone had been avoiding. "You know people will talk," she said bluntly to Jake. "German girl and American cowboy. War's not even over yet." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny what Martha was implying. Let them talk. Annalise looked between them, understanding dawning. She had been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't examined her own feelings. But Martha's words forced recognition of what had been growing quietly between her and Jake. It was more than respect, more than friendship. It was something neither of them had planned but couldn't ignore. The complexity of their situation was staggering. She was technically still a prisoner of war. He was her supervisor. Her country and his were still fighting. Every social convention, every military regulation, every reasonable consideration argued against any relationship beyond professional courtesy. Yet something had been built between them that transcended all those barriers. "Is impossible," Annalise said softly, speaking the truth they all knew. "Maybe," Jake replied, "but that doesn't make it not real." The honesty hung in the air as darkness fell over the prairie, the first stars appearing in the vast Montana sky. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The news reached the Montana camp by radio, crackling through the static with the announcement that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In towns across America, celebrations erupted immediately. Church bells rang, people flooded the streets, strangers embraced in shared joy. But at the Crazy Mountains labor camp, the atmosphere was complicated by emotions that defied simple categorization. The German women gathered in the main hall, listening to Major Carter explain what the surrender meant for them. Repatriation procedures would begin within weeks. They would be processed and returned to Germany as quickly as transportation could be arranged. After more than a year as prisoners of war, they were going home. But the announcement that should have brought relief instead brought confusion and fear. What home were they returning to? Germany existed only as a defeated occupied territory. Cities lay in ruins. The government that had sent them to war no longer existed. Families were scattered or dead. The country itself was being divided among the victorious powers. Annalise sat with Greta and Liesel, the three of them processing what they had just heard. Around them, other women wept, though whether from relief or despair was unclear. Relief that the killing had stopped, despair at what they would face upon return. "You will go back?" Liesel asked the others quietly in German. Greta was silent for a long moment. "My parents are dead. My sister is. Somewhere I can't find her. What am I going back to? Eleanor Hutchinson has already said I could stay with them, help on the ranch." She looked at her friends. "I think I want to stay." Liesel nodded slowly. "Herr Reeves spoke to me last week. He said when the war ended, if I wanted to stay and work, he would sponsor me. His wife wants me to teach art to their grandchildren. I have nothing in Hamburg anymore, nothing but ruins and memories." Both women turned to Annalise, who had been staring at her hands. The decision that faced her was more complicated than theirs. She had Jake to consider now, though neither of them had spoken openly about what existed between them. She also had family she hadn't heard from, a mother and brother who might still be alive in the Soviet-occupied zone. Annalise met their eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me feels I should go back, try to find my family. But part of me fears what I'll find. And part of me," she hesitated, unwilling to voice the deepest truth, "part of me has found something here I never had in Germany." The next day, Major Carter called individual meetings with each prisoner to discuss their intentions. When Annalise entered his office, she found not just the Major but also Jake Morrison, who had been summoned to speak on her behalf. The Major's expression was carefully neutral. "Miss Volker, Mr. Morrison has submitted a formal request. He's asking that you be allowed to remain in the United States under a special visa provision for displaced persons. He's prepared to sponsor you, provide employment and housing, and take responsibility for your integration. The words hung in the air, official and formal, disguising the deeper implications. Annalise sat in Major Carter's office, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Jake stood near the window, his hat in his hands, trying to appear calm despite the tension in his shoulders. The Major had laid out the practical details. If she chose to stay, she would no longer be a prisoner of war, but a displaced person under American supervision. She would need a sponsor, employment verification, and a clear path to eventual citizenship. Jake had already arranged all of it through Martha Collins's ranch. But paperwork couldn't address the moral complexity of the choice. Was she abandoning her duty to her homeland by staying? Was she running away from guilt by choosing the easier path? Or was she simply choosing life over death, hope over despair? Major Carter seemed to understand her internal struggle. "Miss Volker," he said more gently than she expected, "nobody can make this decision for you. But I will say this, I've been overseeing this camp for nearly a year. I've watched you and the other women transform from defeated enemies into valuable members of our community. That transformation matters. It shows what's possible when people choose to be better than their circumstances." Annalise found her voice, speaking slowly in careful English. "My mother, my brother, I don't know if they are alive. If they are in Soviet zone. Very dangerous place now. If I go back, maybe I cannot find them. Maybe I cannot help them. Maybe I just become one more person who needs help." She looked at Jake, then back at the Major. "Here, I can work. I can build something. Maybe later, when things are more stable, I can search for my family. Maybe I can help them come here. Is this wrong? To choose this?" The Major shook his head. "It's not wrong to choose survival. It's not wrong to choose a future. Your country asked you to serve, and you did. But that country doesn't exist anymore. You don't owe allegiance to rubble and chaos." Jake finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Annalise, I can't tell you what to do. This has to be your choice. But I want you to know that if you stay, you won't be alone. You'll have people here who care about what happens to you." He paused, then added quietly, "I care about what happens to you." The admission hung in the air, more significant than any formal declaration. Annalise felt tears building but held them back. She thought about her mother's face, her brother's laugh, the streets of Berlin before the war. Then she thought about the Montana sky, the honest work that filled her days, the community that had accepted her despite every reason not to. She thought about Jake's kindness, Martha's wisdom, the possibility of a life built on something other than ideology and hatred. "I will stay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I will work hard. I will be good American. I will not forget Germany, not forget my family. But I choose this. I choose to stay." Major Carter nodded and began filling out the necessary paperwork. Jake's relief was visible, though he maintained proper decorum in the Major's presence. Outside the window, spring sunshine illuminated the prairie, stretching endlessly toward distant mountains. The summer of 1945 brought sweeping changes to the Crazy Mountains region. Of the 27 German women who had arrived the previous September, 14 chose to remain in the United States. The others, after tearful farewells, boarded transport vehicles that would take them back across the ocean to a homeland none of them fully recognized anymore. Annalise, Greta, and Liesel were among those who stayed, along with Hilda, Margarita, and 9 others. Each had found sponsors, employment, and the beginning of new lives. The transition from prisoners to residents was awkward at first. They were no longer confined to camp, but also not fully free. They carried papers identifying them as displaced persons under supervision. They had to report monthly to immigration officials. Some townspeople remained suspicious, viewing them as former enemies who shouldn't be trusted. But the ranchers who had employed them became fierce advocates. Frank Hutchinson, who had initially resented having German prisoners on his land, now defended Greta's character to anyone who questioned it. Tom Reeves made it clear that anyone who disrespected Liesel would answer to him personally. And Martha Collins spread the word through church networks that these women deserved the same chance at redemption that America offered to everyone. Annalise's position was particularly delicate because of her growing relationship with Jake. They tried to maintain propriety, knowing that any appearance of impropriety would reflect badly on all the German women. but their feelings were obvious to anyone who saw them together. They worked side by side with an ease that spoke of deep understanding. They communicated with glances and small gestures. They protected each other without thinking. By autumn, Jake made his intentions formal. He asked Annalise to marry him on an evening in October, as they watched the sunset from the same porch where Martha had first confronted the reality of their feelings. His proposal was characteristically direct. "I know it's complicated. I know people will talk, but I also know I don't want to spend my life without you. Will you marry me?" Annalise's answer was equally straightforward. Yes. The wedding took place in November of 1945, a small ceremony at Martha's farmhouse with a handful of close friends. Eleanor Hutchinson stood as Annalise's matron of honor. Martha cried openly during the vows. The local pastor who performed the ceremony spoke about forgiveness and new beginnings, about how love could bridge even the deepest divides. Not everyone approved. Some in the community muttered about the impropriety of an American marrying an enemy national so soon after the war. Letters appeared in the local newspaper debating whether such marriages should be allowed. But for every critic, there were two supporters who understood that the ceremony represented something larger than one couple's happiness. It represented the possibility of reconciliation, the promise that hatred need not be permanent, the hope that former enemies could become family. As winter approached, Annalise Morrison, no longer Volker, settled into her new life with a sense of profound gratitude. She had found something in Montana that she never expected to discover. Not just safety or work or even love, but a sense of belonging that had eluded her even in the country of her birth. The years that followed brought both challenges and unexpected joys. Annalise and Jake built a life on the land they both loved, expanding Martha's ranch after the old woman passed away peacefully in 1948, leaving the property to them in her will. The gift came with a handwritten note that Annalise treasured. "You proved that home isn't where you're born, but where you choose to build something good." Greta remained with the Hutchinson family, eventually marrying a local veterinarian she met at a church social in 1947. Her wedding was larger than Annalise's had been, a sign that the community's acceptance had grown. She never learned what happened to her sister in Germany, but she built a new family in Montana, raising 3 children who knew their mother's story and understood the complicated legacy they carried. Liesel became a respected artist, her paintings of Montana landscapes gaining recognition beyond Park County. She traveled to New York for an exhibition in 1952, where a journalist asked her how a German woman came to paint the American West with such intimacy. She answered simply, "This land saved my life. I paint it to say thank you." She never married, finding fulfillment in her art and in teaching children, including Greta's and Annalise's, to see the beauty in the world around them. The other German women who stayed found their own paths. Some married, others remained single. All worked hard, contributed to their communities, and carried the dual identity of who they had been and who they had become. They gathered once a year on the anniversary of their arrival, sharing a meal and remembering the journey that had brought them to this unlikely home. In 1953, Annalise finally received news from Germany. A letter found her through the Red Cross, forwarded through multiple agencies. Her mother had survived the war and was living in West Berlin. Her brother had been killed in the final days of fighting, defending a city that was already lost. The news brought renewed grief but also relief. Her mother was alive. Over the following years, Annalise sent money and care packages to Berlin. She wrote long letters describing her life in Montana, her marriage, and eventually her children. In 1958, she sponsored her mother's immigration to America. The reunion at the Billings train station was emotional beyond words. Her mother, aged and worn by years of hardship, stepped onto the platform and saw her daughter waiting. They embraced for long minutes, speaking German through tears, while Jake stood respectfully aside. Later, her mother would tell her that seeing Annalise happy and settled had erased any regret about leaving Germany behind. "You found what we were all searching for," she said. "A place where you could be yourself without fear, where your work mattered, where kindness was not weakness." The ranch prospered over the decades. Jake and Annalise raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up speaking both English and German, understanding they carried 2 legacies. They learned to rope cattle and ride horses, but they also learned about their mother's journey, and the complicated history that had brought their family into existence. 50 years after that September day when German prisoners first arrived at the Crazy Mountains labor camp, the survivors gathered for a final reunion. It was 1993, and age had taken its toll. Of the 14 women who had chosen to stay, only 8 remained alive. They met at what had been Martha Collins' ranch, now owned by Annalise and Jake's son, who had converted the old barn into a community center. The women, now in their 70s and 80s, embraced with the fierce affection of those who had shared something extraordinary. Greta was there, widowed but surrounded by grandchildren. Liesl came from Billings, where she still painted despite arthritis in her hands. The others arrived from various parts of Montana and neighboring states, gray-haired and slower-moving, but with the same essential spirit that had carried them through their transformation decades earlier. A local historian had organized the gathering, wanting to document their stories before time claimed them entirely. She set up recording equipment and asked them to reflect on their experiences. What began as formal interviews quickly became animated conversation as the women remembered details they hadn't thought about in years. Annalise, now 74, spoke about the day she arrived and how terrifying the openness had seemed. So large we couldn't look away. She repeated the phrase that had become their unofficial motto. That's what we told each other. The land was so large we couldn't look away. And once we stopped looking away, once we really saw it, we couldn't leave. Greta talked about the moment she received news of her parents' death and how Eleanor Hutchinson's simple kindness had kept her from drowning in despair. She saved me by treating me like I mattered, Greta said. Not like a prisoner, not like an enemy, but like a person who deserved comfort. Liesl described discovering that she could capture beauty even after witnessing so much ugliness. This landscape taught me that the world could still be beautiful if you were willing to see it, she explained. That was a kind of redemption I didn't know was possible. The historian asked the question that had driven her research. Why did you choose to stay when you could have gone home? The women looked at each other, and Annalise spoke for all of them. Germany was where we were born, but it was never truly home. Home was what we built here through work and kindness and second chances. Home was people who judged us by our character rather than our nationality. Home was land that didn't care about our past, only about our willingness to respect it. That evening, as the reunion concluded, the women stood together outside the old barn. The Montana sky stretched above them, vast and indifferent as it had always been. Mountains rose in the distance, eternal and unchanging. The prairie grass moved in waves under the wind, the same wind that had blown on the day they arrived 50 years earlier. Jake Morrison, now 76, and moving slowly with a cane, joined his wife. Together they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back?" Annalise took his hand, the calluses of a lifetime's work rough against his palm. "Not once," she said. "Not for a single moment. This land gave us everything. It gave us work that mattered, people who cared, and the chance to become better than we were. What more could anyone ask for?"